Only 2 players have come within 40 yards of Eric Dickerson's single-season rushing record. One is Adrian Peterson. The other is a little more forgotten.
Carries him for a gain of 15.
15-10. Lewis will not be denied. Touchdown, Jamal Lewis. 59 yards, and a lot of that was done by nobody else but Jamal Lewis.
The perfect combination of power and speed, 6 feet tall and 240 pounds. You needed a convoy to bring him down.
Don't you ever think that there's anybody going to bring Jamal Lewis down with one arm. That is impossible. Look at his feet. They don't stop. He just keeps driving and dragging.
If he got loose, he was gone.
I was 231 to be exact. I ran a 4.38 40.
And he's running away from defensive backs here, folks. Look at
No one hit the hole harder than Jamal Lewis. He was the Ravens' offense for the better part of a decade.
When you look at the Ravens, what do you have on offense?
Paul, I think you can make
What do you have?
Well, you've got Jamal Lewis.
Thank you very much.
He ran them to a Super Bowl as a rookie and is responsible for one of the greatest rushing seasons the NFL has ever seen.
a single-game NFL rushing record.
There's 2,000.
Only the fifth man ever with 2,000.
Jamal Lewis dealt with adversity on and off the field, but never stopped producing. He's the type of running back every defense hated playing. The more carries he got, the more damage he did.
I just said if I get the ball 30 times, I'm gonna break a record.
Let's jog your memory. Attending Douglas High School in Atlanta, Georgia, it wasn't long before Jamal Lewis proved himself a star. Described as a man-child, Lewis joined the team as a fullback, but soon became the starting running back. His physical run style made him hard to bring down, and that's if anyone could catch him. Lewis wasn't just a football star, he was also one of the best sprinters in the state. But football was his ticket. With Lewis in the backfield, the Astros' run game was elite. Lewis was a threat to score every time he touched the ball. By his senior year, he was the top running back recruit in the nation. He lived up to that ranking and then some. Douglas fell in the playoffs, but Lewis ended his high school career with nearly 5,000 yards in just 3 years of varsity. He had his pick of the litter when it came to college. Lewis decided on Tennessee.
It really impressed me a lot about the program. I didn't want to stay in Georgia. I wanted to get out of Georgia, get away from my friends and everything so I could focus on handling my business and doing what I have to do.
Nebraska had a chance, but Lewis wanted to stay warm.
Said it was Tennessee or it was Nebraska. He said, but it was just a little too cold in Nebraska.
Lewis also chose Tennessee for early playing time. The Vols lost top rusher Jay Graham to graduation, and Lewis had all the tools to step right in. But the run game was secondary, because Tennessee had a Heisman candidate and top NFL prospect at quarterback, a senior named Peyton Manning. Lewis began his Vols career low on the depth chart, Tennessee deciding to go with experience in the backfield. Lewis spent most of his time on the field in pass protection, but a few games into the season, he got the rock, and Lewis made his case for a promotion. Coming off a loss to Florida, coach Philip Fulmer gave Lewis the start against Ole Miss, and he ran all over the Rebels. 155 yards, and the game-clinching touchdown. The Vols had gotten a taste of what he could do. Peyton Manning praised his maturity. A performance like that cemented his status as starter. The following week, Georgia came to town. They were the top defense in the SEC, but as it turns out, Ole Miss was just the warm-up.
Outside to the 30, runs to a tackle to the 25, to the 20, to the 15, to the 10, to the 7. This Jamal Lewis ran through 2 tackles and just explodes downfield.
Whether he ran through them or past them, Lewis had his way with the Bulldogs defense. He went for over 230 yards. It was a Vols rout. The threat Lewis provided on the ground opened up the passing game. Manning's greatness made it easier for Lewis to run the ball. Tennessee was rolling, and Lewis kept rumbling. He scored 4 touchdowns against Kentucky. He was the second ever volunteer with multiple 200-yard games in a season. The third true freshman in SEC history to lead the conference in rushing, and unsurprisingly, the freshman of the year. And Tennessee didn't lose a game after Lewis became a starter. They extended their streak to 9 after Lewis rushed for 127 yards in a come-from-behind win over Auburn in the SEC championship. They got an Orange Bowl bid, but they ran into a dominant Nebraska team and experienced their first loss in nearly 3 months. It was a tough end of the season, but Jamal Lewis showed out with a conference-leading 1,364 rush yards and 7 touchdowns, while even hauling in 23 passes for 266 yards and 2 more touchdowns. It would be a very different Vols team in '98, mainly because Manning was gone. In his place, Junior T. Martin, And Martin still had some weapons, with guys like Peerless Price and Jermaine Copeland. But the biggest buzz was around Jamal Lewis, the sophomore now considered a Heisman candidate. Lewis was somehow an even more physically imposing force as a sophomore, and he had some lofty goals for the '98 season. But over 140 yards in a season-opening win against Syracuse was a good start. Next came the highly ranked Florida Gators, responsible for Tennessee's only regular season loss last year. The Gators held Lewis in check, but Tennessee got the win. With Lewis leading the way, they were national championship contenders. In their fourth game of the year against Auburn, Lewis took it to the house on the first play from scrimmage. But after totaling 140 yards, Lewis got injured. It seemed innocent enough until the MRI came back. Officially a torn LCL, Lewis's Heisman campaign was over. It was a huge loss for Tennessee, but they had a deep backfield, and Travis Henry emerged as a star in his own right. The Vols turned in an undefeated season. They were SEC champions once again, and with the Fiesta Bowl win over Florida State, they were national champs as well. Lewis's abbreviated season seeing him rush for 497 yards and 3 touchdowns, while adding 1 more touchdown on his only reception of the season. It may not have been the way he planned, but Jamal Lewis was a national champion. He was now healthy, and Tennessee began their quest for a repeat in '99. Martin was back for his senior year and had a good receiving core led by junior Cedric Wilson. And even after a major injury, Lewis was a Heisman favorite, the lead back in one of the most talented backfields in the nation. In his first game back versus Wyoming, he looked Heisman worthy. He had a pair of fumbles, yet still carried the ball 25 times for nearly 160 yards and 3 touchdowns, becoming the fastest player in Vols history to reach 2,000 career rushing yards. In their next game versus Florida, Lewis found the end zone twice, but hopes of another undefeated season came to an early end. If Lewis was on the field, he was probably getting the ball. Teams were anticipating that. Lewis was held to below 100 yards in his next 3 games after the season opener. He was trying to run smarter, but that wasn't his style, so he decided to go back to his old ways. Just hit the hole and go from there. But he was taking a beating, slowed down by a lingering shoulder injury for most of the season, which led to Henry getting more touches, and in turn producing, even becoming the starter. Tennessee was still a great team. Their defense was their strong point, and their offense was dangerous. But the Heisman hopes of Lewis had been dashed, and after a late season loss to Arkansas, so were the Vols' hopes for a national championship. They wouldn't even compete for the conference championship, and their season ended with a loss to Nebraska in the Fiesta Bowl. Lewis wrapped up his comeback year with 816 rush yards and 7 touchdowns, while adding 193 yards on 15 receptions and 1 more touchdown. As it turned out, the Fiesta Bowl would be the last game for Lewis in a Vols uniform. Less than a week later, he declared for the NFL draft. It hadn't been the season he had hoped for, but Lewis felt prepared, and through it all, he was all but penciled in as a first-round pick. Then, at both the Combine and his Pro Day, the 230-pounder blew everyone away, recording some otherworldly physical measurements for a player his size. Lewis looked more like a first-round lock, but now the question became, how high would he go?
Baltimore Ravens select Jamal Lewis, running back, University of Tennessee.
Jamal Lewis was the first running back and 5th player off the board. The Ravens and Lewis received a lot of criticism around a seemingly injury-prone back going top 5, but the Baltimore Ravens got the man they referred to as their key to the draft, a potential 300-carry workhorse, according to head coach Brian Billick. And a few months later, they had their next franchise back locked up for 6 years. The Ravens were still a relatively new team. On the defensive side of the ball, they had things all figured out. Offense was a different story. Their passing attack had been virtually non-existent, and while they brought in future Hall of Famer Shannon Sharpe this season, they would still be near the bottom of the league. Their run game last year had been decent, but their top rusher Eric Rett was now a Brown. Lewis was brought in to be the future, but he began his career as a backup to the 4th-year Priest Holmes. Lewis saw minimal action over the first 2 weeks. He was eased back in after a preseason elbow injury, yet Baltimore would win both games. Lewis got the starting nod in week 3. He didn't do a lot, but he did break a 45-yard run in a loss to the Dolphins. The following week versus Cincy, he made his case as the franchise back, rushing for over 100 yards on 25 carries and a touchdown. He had breakaway speed to go with his power running. He was a solid receiver out of the backfield, and by week 7, he was the permanent starter. He struggled during a 3-game losing streak, but then he hit his stride. Over the final 7 games of the year, he rushed for over 830 yards and 5 touchdowns. He went for a season-high 187 yards against Dallas. A week later, he went for 170 and 2 touchdowns against Cleveland. Baltimore's passing attack was inconsistent, but on the ground, they had found someone they could count on. Running behind All-Pro Jonathan Ogden, Lewis was a top 10 rusher in the league and finished second in Rookie of the Year voting. He was only the second best Lewis on the team, but according to the 5th-year leader of an elite Ravens defense, the two Lewises were one and the same, and with both dominating, Baltimore won each of those final 7 games. It was a rocky first half of the season, but they finished at 12-4, enough for a wildcard berth and a matchup with Denver. The Ravens defense held the Broncos to 3 points. On offense, Lewis accounted for more than half the team's total yards and found the end zone twice. Even when he messed up, it still led to a touchdown. The Ravens won easily and were set to take on Tennessee in the divisional. Lewis wouldn't be able to get much going in this game, but he did find the end zone in another Ravens win. Next up was the Oakland Raiders in the conference championship. Oakland made him work for it, but Lewis was able to rack up 100 yards from scrimmage. Overall, there wasn't a lot of scoring, but another masterful performance from the Ravens defense had the franchise making their first ever Super Bowl appearance. Taking on the New York Giants, Lewis continued as a workhorse, racking up over 100 yards on 27 carries, as the Ravens controlled the game on offense and abused the Giants on defense. Lewis even found the end zone, and a dominant playoff run ended with a Super Bowl championship. And Lewis ended his rookie year with 1,364 rush yards and 6 touchdowns, while hauling in 27 passes for another 296 yards. Lewis had exceeded expectations and had made good on his pre-draft promise.
Ozzie Lewis was on the phone, and Ozzie told me, he said, "Hey, what did you tell me when you came up here to visit?" And I told him I would be as good or better than any back in the AFC North.
The Ravens had a legitimate shot to repeat as champs, but all that faded during training camp.
When star running back Jamal Lewis went down in camp, it seemed like a simple sprain. But the final verdict was a coach's worst nightmare.
Baltimore Ravens suffered a big blow on Wednesday as running back Jamal Lewis suffered a torn ACL in practice and is likely lost for the entire season.
He wasn't even 21 years old and had suffered ligament tears to both knees. It was bad enough the Ravens lost their star for the year, but the injury had many wondering if the draft day critics were right. So after an 0-1 season that ended at the hands of the Steelers in the divisional, the Ravens had their guy back for the 0-2 season.
Coming back in 2002, of course, I was hungrier than I don't know what.
It had only been a year and a half since their Super Bowl title, yet the team looked a lot different, and any hopes of a competitive offense rested on the shoulders of Lewis. But he had plenty of time to recover, and come the season opener, he was starting. He couldn't get much going over the first 4 weeks, as Baltimore started 1-2. But in week 5 against Cleveland, Lewis showed he still had it, going for 187 yards and averaging over 7 yards a carry. The next week he scored 2 touchdowns against the Colts. It was great to see Lewis running hard, but he wouldn't be able to keep up the consistency. Over the final 11 games, Lewis would rush for at least 100 yards in 4 of them, but would also fail to surpass 50 yards in 5 of them. All things considered, it was still a great comeback season, going for over 1,300 yards on the ground, and it was a lot harder to be effective when defenses were selling out to stop the run. The Ravens' line was banged up, and once again they didn't have much of a passing attack. They got a good showing out of second-year tight end Todd Heap and a career year from receiver Travis Taylor, but neither cracked 900 yards. Lewis would actually have his best receiving season, putting up career highs in receptions and receiving yards to finish 3rd on the team. Then on defense, the Ravens added a ball-hawking rookie named Ed Reed, yet that wasn't enough to keep them from having one of the worst pass defenses in the league. Some thought Lewis and Reed should be Pro Bowlers, but those honors are less likely when you're on a team struggling to stay above 500. In the end, it was a 7-9 finish in Baltimore, and no postseason, as Lewis finished his year with 1,327 rush yards and 6 touchdowns, while adding 47 catches, for 442 yards and one more touchdown. It hadn't been perfect, and ball security was definitely an issue, but Jamal Lewis had just racked up nearly 1,800 yards from scrimmage in his comeback year. Yet, as a lot of people say, a player doesn't fully return to form until their second season after major injury. In Jamal Lewis's case, that ended up being very true. It was another season of trying to find a QB in Baltimore. They hoped rookie Kyle Bowler was the answer, but they wouldn't even get a full season out of him. Baltimore had the worst passing attack in the NFL, yet somehow they were top 8 in points scored. A much improved defense definitely played a part in that, but the main reason was in the backfield, wearing number 31. Lewis had a modest performance in a Week 1 loss to Pittsburgh, but then the Cleveland Browns came to town.
We're talking about Jamal Lewis, fourth-year running back, Baltimore Ravens. Earl Little, who's a safety, he actually told my teammate that he was going to run over us and he was going to break the NFL rushing record.
It's Jamal Lewis. Got an opening. I'd say he's going to get his touches.
Jamal Lewis walked the walk. His first touch was an 82-yard house call. By the end of the first, he was over 100 yards. By halftime, he was up to 180. The single-game record was in sight.
When I was going in for halftime and Jonathan Ogden said, let's go get it. We can get 300 yards. Let's go get the record.
A quiet third quarter made things more difficult, but Lewis kicked off the fourth with a bang. A 63-yard touchdown put him within 20 yards of Corey Dillon's record. On Baltimore's next possession, he got it.
Jamal has given his all to the Ravens and their capacity crowd today. A single-game NFL rushing record.
By the end, Lewis hadn't hit 300, but he had come pretty close and impressed everybody.
When I was sitting at home and I got a call from it was a Baltimore number, I didn't know who it was, and I answered it, and I just heard a voice that I knew on the other side, and he said, "Jamal, this is Art Modell." He said that was one of the best performances that I have seen since Jim Brown.
The lid was off, and no one would be able to contain Jamal Lewis. The Cleveland game kicked off a 6-game streak with at least 100 yards on the ground. Overall, Lewis surpassed the century mark in 12 games. There was really nothing teams could do. Lewis hit the holes hard. He put his shoulder down and never stopped moving his legs. One man couldn't bring him down. You could stack the box, but then Lewis would just use his 4.3 speed to break it outside. And running to the left was automatic yardage, with massive lanes being opened by both Ogden and the newly re-signed Edwin Mulatalo. Lewis was beating up on the AFC North especially. He went for 180 yards and 3 touchdowns to beat the Bengals late in the year. 2 weeks later, he gave the Browns deja vu when he went for 205 and 2 touchdowns. Going into the season finale versus Pittsburgh, Lewis was 48 yards away from 2,000. It only took him the first quarter to become the 5th player in history to reach that mark, yet he had his eyes set on an even bigger milestone. Pittsburgh had always done a better job than most in containing Jamal Lewis, and after his big first quarter, they made things a lot harder. Even with overtime, he fell 40 yards short of Eric Dickerson's record. Jamal Lewis, after 2 major knee injuries, had just led the league in rushing with 2,066 yards, the second highest total in NFL history at the time. His career-high 14 rushing touchdowns was also top 3 in the NFL. He was first-team All-Pro and the Offensive Player of the Year. However, in a season which would already have co-MVPs, Lewis would only finish 4th in voting. Pretty shocking considering he was Baltimore's entire offense. The Ravens had a 10-win season. It was the first division title for a Baltimore team since they were the Colts. Without Lewis, it would have been a lot worse. So no MVP, but the pressure was off. Lewis had hit 2,000 and had run the Ravens back into the playoffs. The playoffs brought the Titans, the league's top rusher, against its stingiest run defense. Tennessee sold out on stopping Lewis, and it worked. He averaged just 2.5 yards a carry and was held to below 40 total yards. The game was close, but a last-second Titans field goal brought a disappointing end to a historic season, as Lewis finished the year rushing for 2,066 yards and 14 touchdowns on over 5 yards a carry, and would also add 26 receptions for another 205 yards. Jamal Lewis had a dream season. If there was any criticism to be made, it was his fumbles. But it didn't change the fact that Lewis was arguably the most dangerous weapon in football, and it didn't seem like anything could stop him. Less than 2 months after their playoff loss, Lewis was indicted on federal drug charges. According to the case, Lewis was accused of helping a friend facilitate a drug deal for multiple kilos of coke back in the summer of 2000. At the time, Lewis had been drafted by the Ravens, but had yet to sign a contract. Allegedly, Lewis was in cell phone contact trying to set up a deal with an individual who ended up being an FBI informant. In the end, no drugs were purchased, but Lewis was still charged with intent to distribute and conspiring to commit a felony, among other things, and was facing up to 10 years behind bars. Lewis would plead not guilty, and it was unfortunate that something from years ago had to come up now, as most people around him noticed increased maturity and better choices since he joined the Ravens. But he was still involved in a serious crime. His reputation was tarnished, and his future was in jeopardy. The Ravens stood behind Lewis throughout the offseason. More details came out which really put into question just how much Lewis was actually involved. Lewis used the anger over the charges to motivate his workouts, getting in the best shape of his career. The 04 season started, and Lewis was with the team, yet still awaiting trial. Baltimore hadn't made any notable changes in their offense. They had acquired Terrell Owens from the 49ers, but it turned out that San Francisco didn't actually hold his rights at the time of the trade. So it would be no Owens, and in turn, another one-dimensional Ravens offense, with Lewis leading the way. Lewis was quiet over his first 2 games, but he looked more like himself in a Week 3 win over Cincy, going for a season-high 186 yards on over 10 yards a carry, while adding 46 more yards through the air. Just days later, he had reached a plea agreement. He'd likely still have to serve a few months of jail time, but that's a lot better than the 10 years he was facing, and he wouldn't have to serve his time until after the season. So with that mostly over, Lewis could focus on football. 2 weeks after the Bengals game, he went for 116 in a win over Washington. Baltimore improved to 3-2, but that would be Lewis's last game for nearly a month. Lewis received a 2-game suspension and a hefty fine from the NFL after his guilty plea. He was back for Week 9 and had 2 solid games before being knocked out for 2 more weeks with an ankle injury. Then over his final 4, he was up and down, but would still record his 4th straight 1,000-yard season. The Ravens with Lewis were 8-4. Without him, they were 1-3. A 9-7 record wasn't enough for the postseason. Lewis wrapped up his eventful year with 1,006 yards and 7 touchdowns on the ground, along with 10 receptions for 116 yards through the air. Jamal Lewis spent most of his offseason in jail, serving a 4-month sentence shortly after the 04 season. He would be released in June and eventually rejoin the Ravens in early August. But he was confused. The Ravens had shown loyalty to him after the charge. Now he was hoping to be rewarded for his on-field production, but he couldn't even get a call back. Baltimore had added a legit number 1 receiver in Derek Mason, but it was another season of shaky QB play, as Baltimore was again near the bottom of the league in passing. Usually the Ravens would just lean on the ground game, but this season would be one of the worst of Lewis's career. He was recovering after offseason ankle surgery and just didn't look the same on the field. He didn't have his first 100-yard game until Week 12. He was still the Ravens' leading rusher, but would fail to reach 1,000 yards for the first time in his career. Some felt it was the lack of an extension. Lewis acknowledged that he was reluctant to play as physical as usual in hopes of avoiding a major injury in what was a contract year. Baltimore's offense rarely found the end zone. No matter how well their defense played, the offense couldn't put any points on the board. Their 2-7 start to the season was the worst in franchise history. They would play above 500 the rest of the way, but the damage was done. A 6-10 record meant the Ravens missed the postseason again, and Lewis ended his year with 906 rush yards and 3 touchdowns, while adding 32 receptions for 191 yards and another touchdown. After 6 years, Jamal Lewis was a free agent. Some expected the Ravens to franchise tag him, but they didn't. Lewis had full freedom to find a new team, but then came a league-wide salary cap increase. The Ravens had some more breathing room, and just a couple weeks after letting him walk, Lewis and the Ravens were back together, agreeing on a 3-year deal. Maybe part of the reason they brought back Lewis was because they finally had a legitimate offense. The Ravens made one of the biggest acquisitions in franchise history after trading for former MVP Steve McNair, finally giving them an impactful quarterback. Baltimore also had a respectable trio of pass catchers in Derek Mason, Todd Heap, and second-year standout Mark Clayton, and Lewis wasn't mad at that. It seemed like he would finally have some room to operate on the ground. But 6 games in, and it was another slow start. Having an actual passing attack led to less carries for Lewis, better on his body, but not the type of play style that made him effective. Coming out of the bye week, Lewis went for 109 yards on a season-high 31 carries in a win over New Orleans. This kicked off a 5-game win streak. During that time, Lewis had a 3-touchdown performance versus Atlanta. It took him a lot of carries to get there, but Lewis again surpassed 1,000 yards. He was a good scoring threat. His 9 rushing touchdowns were the second most of his career. For the first time since Lewis was drafted, he was playing on a balanced offense. And Baltimore's defense was the best it had been since their Super Bowl win. The Ravens won 9 of their final 10. Overall, they went 13-3. They won the division and looked good entering a playoff matchup with the Colts. Indy had the worst rush defense in the NFL, yet Lewis could only manage 53 yards. And 4 Ravens turnovers didn't do them any good. It was a surprisingly low-scoring game, but the Colts scored more, and Baltimore's season came to an abrupt end as Lewis finished with 1,132 rush yards and 9 touchdowns, along with 18 catches for 115 more yards. Lewis underwent more ankle surgery shortly after the season, but this time Baltimore decided to move on from Lewis for good, releasing the back in late February. Reportedly, they wanted to explore re-signing him, but the chances of that disappeared when Lewis signed a 1-year deal with division rival Cleveland in early March. Lewis would say he joined the Browns because they had a greater commitment to running the football. The analytics didn't really support that claim, but Lewis was convinced things were about to change, starting with an improved Cleveland O-line, strengthened most through the draft, when Cleveland found their Jonathan Ogden in Wisconsin tackle Joe Thomas. And it wasn't long after the draft before the great Jim Brown got an up-close look at Jamal Lewis. He liked what he saw. The Browns definitely didn't have a Ravens-caliber defense, but on offense there was some potential, with second-year QB Derek Anderson and a young wide receiver tight end duo of Braylon Edwards and Kellen Winslow Jr. Lewis started slow in a Week 1 loss to Pittsburgh, but in Week 2, he showed he had a lot left in the tank.
Inside Jamal Lewis. Jamal Lewis will score!
In a complete shootout between the Browns and the Bengals, Lewis received 27 carries. He finished with 216 rush yards and a touchdown. He was quieter over the next couple weeks, then would be sidelined early in Week 5. He stayed there until after the bye week, but in just his second game back, he rushed for 4 touchdowns against the Seahawks. He really started doing some damage after that. He was getting the carries he wanted. In his return to Baltimore, Lewis went for 92 yards and a touchdown. The Browns beat the Ravens for the second time this season. The following week, he went for 134 and a score in a win over Houston. Across the final 4 games, Lewis averaged over 125 rushing yards, and the Browns went 3-1. Lewis put together one of the best seasons of his career. He was a top 5 rusher in the league. Even after years in the NFL, he was still a back that did better with volume. When most other players were tired and beat down, Jamal Lewis was at his best. His addition, one of the main reasons for the Browns putting together their first 10-win season since rejoining the NFL in 1999. They tied Pittsburgh for the best record in the division, but would still miss the playoffs. Lewis's resurgent year in Cleveland, seeing him rush for 1,304 yards and 9 touchdowns, while adding 30 receptions for 248 yards and 2 more touchdowns. Lewis had bet on himself with the 1-year deal. He performed, and it landed him a 3-year extension. He was ready to build on last season. After what felt like a dream season in 2007, it was more of a nightmare in Cleveland for 2008. It was a revolving door at quarterback, which left their offense on life support all season. Lewis wouldn't have any monster games this year, but he was consistent, rushing for at least 60 yards in 9 games. That may not seem like a lot, but it was often the best Lewis could do, since the Browns were playing from behind in most games. They had a decent 4-6 start to the year, but it hadn't been pretty at all. At this point, Lewis had already expressed frustration over a lack of effort from some players. But over the final 6 games, it got embarrassing. Cleveland did not score a single offensive touchdown. They didn't record a single point across the final 2 games. They went 0-6 in that stretch. One of the only positives coming in Week 16, when Lewis surpassed 10,000 career rush yards. In just 1 year, Cleveland went from playoff hopeful to cellar dweller, but Lewis still managed 1,002 yards on the ground and 4 touchdowns, as well as 23 receptions for 178 yards through the air. Jamal Lewis had been running hard for nearly a decade in the NFL, He was entering year 10 and he had taken a beating. He began the 09 season as the Browns starter. He played in the first 2 games, then was sidelined for the next 2. He returned and went for 117 yards in a win over the Bills. It was Cleveland's first win of the season. Over the next 6, Lewis couldn't get much going on the ground. His carries and yards were low. Cleveland lost every game. During that stretch, Lewis announced that this season would be it. He expressed unhappiness around the treatment of players. But Lewis probably wasn't expecting his farewell tour to be over as soon as it was, as about a month after his announcement, he was placed on IR. A severe concussion had left doctors very concerned about the health of his brain. They couldn't clear him to play in the final 5 games for a Browns team that ended with 5 wins. And Lewis finished his final season with 500 yards on the ground and an extra 88 yards on 8 receptions through the air. So Jamal Lewis retired from football, but over the next few years, he would have some serious financial struggles. But mentally, it was even more difficult. Lewis would explain in later years the impact of undiagnosed concussions. Unfortunately, this led to some long-lasting cognitive effects. Lewis had also lost his identity without football, and it put him in a dark place post-retirement. But in a more positive light, it seems that Lewis is doing much better in recent years, making podcast appearances and finding his footing in a new chapter of life. Jamal Lewis hit the NFL the same way he hit the hole, hard and fast. He was a star from the moment he set foot in the league. He dealt with major and minor injuries throughout his career, but kept his physical running style. He came within 40 yards of the single-season rushing record on 2 surgically repaired knees. And while he could never again reach that peak, it set such a high standard that his other seasons go underappreciated. Jamal Lewis was a 1,000-yard rusher in 8 of his 10 seasons, and was basically the entire Ravens offense for half a decade, and has a Super Bowl ring to show for it. He ran viciously, but didn't try to bring attention to himself. He overcame adversity and walked away from the game to save his health. Jamal Lewis isn't completely forgotten, but when you're part of the 2K club, you deserve to be put on a pedestal. But that's it for today's episode on Jamal Lewis. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on another Tennessee Volunteer, or this one on a player he won a Super Bowl with. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.